Welcome back to part 2 of my review of The Last Jedi. You can find part 1 of my review in the description if you are just tuning in. If you are new to the AT-AT Chat, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you can get updated on my latest content. The Last Jedi is again such a multi-layered film. The cinematography is actually motivated by the narrative. The musical cues are almost so perfectly intertwined with the movie that I'd argue you could watch this without any dialogue and completely understand everything. Plus, if you have the digital download from the Blu-ray, you can actually access this feature. I suggest you watch it just to see how the cinematography and the score work together in the film. I found this film to be the most beautifully shot Star Wars film, period. Steve Yedlin, the director of photography, is a longtime collaborator and friend of Rian Johnson. His framing has so much detail. Each scene is so visually arresting, and they completely serve the emotion of the scenes and characters. Again, this is my opinion, but I will stand by this. I'm not sure how many of you are deep dive film nerds, but Steve and Rian really wanted to capture, again, the Akira Kurosawa style of filmmaking to enhance the emotional power of the scenes the actors are in. The original Star Wars borrowed heavily from the narrative structure of Hidden Fortress, but in this case, the visual aesthetic is what was the most important thing to capture. While we are watching Luke on screen in this film, everything from the color palette to the background elements, rain, wind, crashing waves, they're all representations of Luke's inner emotional life. I think a lot of people happen to overlook this very large detail of the film, or at least people that didn't care for the film. The bland color is on purpose. The changing weather constantly is on purpose. Luke's mind is on fire with regret and guilt over the past and his future. He's literally ready to die. Similar scenes throughout the film play out in a way that lets us better understand the character's emotional states. A great example of this is Kylo Ren in the elevator after being completely berated by Snoke. Surrounded by flickering light, Kylo Ren is full of conflicting emotion again. My assumption here is that Rian and Steve wanted Kylo surrounded by light flickering in and out to represent his own struggle with his light side. Like I've mentioned in the previous review, Kylo's allegiance to the dark side is proven pointless. He is gaining no momentum. Will he turn to the light? Will he go further into the dark side? Well, I think the way he gets off the elevator and walks into darkness is our answer. Ben fully chooses the dark, we just haven't fully realized it yet. It could be argued that the inverse of this was the highly contentious scene with Leia. Leia is bathed in white, surrounded by infinite darkness. If I had to guess, this is an on-the-nose expression of Leia being the galaxy's last hope. And what happens after is the living or cosmic force deciding that Leia is needed still as a beacon of hope within the galaxy. And no, there is no plot hole with the door scene. If you pay attention, Leia goes through one door and then gets to the next door, the one she puts her hand on, and once that opens, the previous door does close. At least that's the mechanics of how the ship works, but we just don't see it. The fact that we don't see the door shut behind her and lock isn't a plot hole, it's just an unnecessary shot. Anyway, this moment in the film is extremely important regardless of how you feel about the execution. We don't get to really criticize what the Force can or can't do, since every installment since 1977 has introduced a new Force ability without setup. Leia is the daughter of Darth Vader, the Chosen One. She also has shown potential in the Force in The Empire Strikes Back, as well as Return of the Jedi. It's not much of a stretch to imagine that in her 30 years after the Battle of Endor, she didn't at least pick up some ability to tune into the Force in some various way. Hell, we literally see her sense Han's death at the end of The Force Awakens, and in The Last Jedi, she senses Luke becoming one with the Force. I mentioned in part 1 of my review that the Force has become mysterious again. We find out that it's possible to cut yourself off from the Force, which is sort of insane. Since Luke is the son of Anakin, who was born of the Force, then I would assume that it's extremely challenging to do, and beyond knowing what happened between Luke and Kylo, he looks weary by just merely existing. Perhaps he is so tired from constantly pushing out all possible connection to the Force. What even made me more curious was when he reconnected to the Force, it almost seemed painful. And it's only when Luke reconnects to the Force that we finally get that last lesson with Yoda. It almost seems like Yoda is also physical in this film, having the ability to destroy the Uneti tree from beyond the grave. We have never seen something like this before, or at least not something like this in the main film saga. For me, it just means that we really don't know shit about Force ghosts, and that's how it should be. I like being able to understand a lot about Star Wars, but I also like when things are left up for us to interpret. I do think we will get some more play on this motif though in the last installment of the saga. This is just my assumption. When this film started introducing flashbacks rather than force-back visions about what happened to Ben Solo in his past, I found myself captivated by the idea that the most honest, loyal Jedi in the galaxy would have such a falling out with his own nephew. The audience knows at this point that Ben Solo has abandonment issues. Before knowing anything about Luke, we assume that his parents' neglect were the main culprit of Ben's turn towards the dark side. And yes, this is part of it. We also know that Snoke was meddling with Kylo ever since his conception. But there is always something that breaks the camel's back, and through flashbacks, we get more points of view on what really occurred between the two of them. It's interesting that we really don't know exactly what happened still, even after hearing the third version of the altercation with Ben. Luke initially omits some very important information to Rey. Kylo feels completely justified in his version since he woke up to an ignited blade ready to strike him. He even sees Sith eyes in Luke's face in his memory. And finally, we get to this middle version where we sort of see this grand misunderstanding, but either way, we are left up to this interpretation of the event, and I love this. Like I said, looking into the future can cause dangerous outcomes. Luke was doing what he thought best, knowing he had sensed darkness growing in his nephew, but by looking into Ben's mind and reacting humanly to what he saw and felt, ultimately was the cause of Ben's final turn. Even his uncle turned his back on him. From Ben's perspective, he has been cast out as the black sheep amongst his hero family, and the only person who even remotely has his back is Snoke, or so we think, and he identifies with his grandfather. It's just fucking sad. Star Wars does not usually dive heavily into the repercussions of being abandoned and how that might wreak havoc. You could argue that Anakin felt abandoned, or at least felt estranged from his past after joining the Jedi Order, but the difference is that Anakin chooses to leave, and Ben is forced to go study with his uncle because he has become too much of a burden on his parents. If you want to understand a little more the context as to the dynamic between Ben and his parents, check out the Last Jedi novelization as well as Last Shot. There is not too much in the novels, but there are some tasty bits to ponder over. When we look at Rey and the realization that she was thrown away by her parents or caregivers, whatever they happened to really turn into, J.J. Abrams' mystery box returns. It really throws any valid criticism I can see about her being too perfect or a Mary Sue. Rey starts her life as the child of two drunk junkers, as we find out, and is traded away so they can feed their addiction. That is beyond fucked up. It is no wonder why Rey and Kylo are moving so closer to one another. They are the only two Force users we know who can actually understand each other. By the time of The Last Jedi, that means Rey has literally been alone, stranded on a planet with no one to guide her. She had to raise herself, learn to defend herself, and survive. And of course she would be skilled at combat, having lived on the vile planet such as Jakku. We see her skills firsthand in The Force Awakens, and it's also easy to recognize during Rey and Kylo's duel that Kylo is being a little coy with Rey, and not interested in killing her. He's intrigued. Had Ren not been wounded or interested in this scavenger girl, he would have sliced her up the back just like Finn. So we have these two Force users with abandonment issues, aligning in the film's third act. This might be the closest we ever get to seeing the light and dark merge into the mythical gray zone we all want so much in the saga. Their ride up the elevator gives us two very different points of view on the outcome of this coming together. Rey's convinced that Kylo will not bow to Supreme Leader, and he will turn. Kylo's convinced that she will be the one by his side when the moment comes. Essentially, all of this is true depending on your point of view. They very much do come together in what is one of the best lightsaber sequences I've ever seen. I say sequences because there are officially no duels in this film, but what plays out in Snoke's throne room is magical. Yes, a blade disappears during the fight, but there's also Muppets in the movie. Not sure I should care too much about this minor mistake. Also, Force kicks. Some fans reacted very poorly to Kylo defeating Snoke. After 2 years of wondering who this guy is, it ends up that the answer is nothing. He is only Snoke, this master of manipulation and of the Force. But he is not immune to the false glimpses of the future, and Kylo just cuts him in half like Darth Maul. What is interesting to me is that Snoke narrates his own death. Even he can't fully comprehend the future of what the Force wills. From a certain point of view, Snoke was the true enemy, or at least the last test, and perhaps Kylo striking him down is the end of Snoke's training. After all, if we were dealing with the Sith, the apprentice would kill the master and get his own apprentice. This is just an analog to the old motif with the rule of two set forth by Darth Bane. I think it's amazing that we finally have this wannabe Sith destroy his master and take the mantle as ruler of the galaxy. This is the embodiment of finishing what Darth Vader started. I love that episode 9 is wide open for JJ to explore. There really is no setup. At this point, Luke has become one with the Force, Leia is on her way to the unknown regions, the Outer Rim, to meet with her allies, and Kylo is now the supreme leader. And the Force is awakening throughout the galaxy in people. Maybe Rey will read the Jedi books and start an order of her own between The Last Jedi and episode 9. But I really like that we won't be able to speculate much based on how the film ended. It really is self-contained, just like the original Star Wars. And if I had to give a score to The Last Jedi compared to the entire franchise, I would give it somewhere near a B+, A-. It's a fantastic piece of work, it's incredible to look at, and it raises the stakes in the Star Wars narrative like we've never seen. Sure, there are some goofy parts in the film that made my eyes roll, but what Star Wars film didn't have its own campy issues? So this concludes my review of The Last Jedi. I hope you have found what I've said interesting, and if you have anything you would want me to specifically talk about, leave a comment down below, and I will create a video around that. Thanks everyone, and AT-AT signing off.